Derived from John Moses Browning's World War I designs, the M1919 was an air-cooled, belt-fed, 36 machine gun capable of sustained fire when properly handled. It was lighter than water-cooled predecessors, simpler to maintain and adaptable to multiple roles, tripod-mounted for infantry, vehicle-mounted for mobility, or positioned defensively with ease. Most importantly, it fed from cloth or metallic belts holding hundreds of rounds. Where Japanese gunners worked strip by strip, American crews fed the M1919 continuously. One assistant gunner managed the belt. Another watched barrels and ammunition. Fire discipline existed, but it was built around maintaining pressure, not conserving rounds. These differences were not accidental. They reflected two national assumptions. Japan assumed battles would be decided by resolve, endurance, and the ability to hold prepared positions against superior numbers. The United States assumed battles would be decided by overwhelming material force applied methodically, relentlessly, and without pause. When Japan went to war in December 1941, these assumptions had not yet been tested against one another on equal footing. Early Japanese victories at Hong Kong, the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies seemed to validate their doctrine. Fixed defences, aggressive infantry tactics, and well-sighted machine guns had worked against poorly prepared opponents. But those early campaigns did not yet place the Type 92 under prolonged pressure from American combined arms doctrine. That test would come later, on islands where terrain limited manoeuvre, where resupply was contested, where sustained fire, minute after minute, decided whether an advance lived or died. By the time American forces landed on Guadalcanal in August 1942, both weapons had arrived, carrying the weight of their nation's expectations. They had been built for different wars. And now, for the first time, they were about to face the same one. When the Browning M1919 and the Type 92 finally met under sustained combat conditions, their differences were no longer theoretical. They became mechanical realities, revealed not in manuals, but in mud, sweat, and time. The M1919, officially standardized in the late 1930s, reflected a mature industrial design philosophy. It was air-cooled, eliminating the weight and complexity of water jackets. Its 36 cartridge delivered high velocity and flat trajectory, effective for suppression well beyond typical jungle engagement ranges. Most critically, the belt-fed system allowed continuous fire so long as ammunition and crew coordination held. American training emphasized teamwork. A machine gun crew was not a single soldier but a system: gunner, assistant gunner, ammunition bearers. Barrels could be swapped, belts could be linked, fire could be sustained in carefully controlled bursts for extended periods without the gun falling silent. The Type 92, by contrast, was engineered for reliability under isolation. Its design descended from earlier Hotchkiss systems adapted for Japanese service. The gun's rigid feed strips were sturdy and resistant to dirt, but they limited speed. Each strip had to be manually inserted, fired, removed, and replaced. Under calm conditions, this worked. Under continuous pressure, it created pauses, seconds that mattered. M92's weight and tripod made it extremely stable. In defensive emplacements, it could deliver accurate fire across fixed lanes. Japanese crews trained extensively to conceal these guns, integrate them into natural terrain, and support infantry movement. In prepared positions, the Type 92 was dangerous. But Pacific warfare rarely allowed ideal conditions. Jungle humidity fouled mechanisms. Rain soaked ammunition. Air attacks and naval bombardment disrupted supply. When American forces applied sustained suppressive fire, Japanese gun crews were forced to respond faster than their weapon was designed to allow. This was not a failure of craftsmanship. Dense jungle restricted visibility. Terrain fragmented units. Resupply was unreliable. In this environment, machine guns did not just support infantry, they defined engagement ranges. Japanese forces relied heavily on entrenched Type 92 positions to break American advances and protect defensive lines. These guns were sighted with care, covering trails, river crossings, and open ground. Early encounters confirmed their lethality. Marines advancing without adequate suppression paid for it immediately, but as American units adapted, the pattern shifted. Marine machine gun sections learned to identify Japanese firing points by sound and tracer, Once located, M1919s were brought forward, sometimes dragged by hand through mud to establish suppressive dominance. Instead of short exchanges, American gunners maintained steady fire, forcing Japanese crews to stay low, reload repeatedly, and eventually lose the initiative. This sustained pressure mattered most during Japanese counterattacks. Night assaults, a hallmark of Japanese tactics, depended on closing distance quickly. Under cover of darkness, infantry surged forward, relying on momentum and surprise. But when American machine guns opened up, firing continuously into likely avenues of approach, that momentum collapsed. The M1919's belt-fed endurance allowed Marines to maintain fire through entire assaults, denying Japanese troops the pauses they needed to regroup. By late 1942, after-action reports from US units increasingly described Japanese attacks breaking apart before reaching effective range. The reason was consistent: machine gun suppression that did not relent. New Guinea reinforced the lesson. In the Bunagona campaign, Australian and American forces faced Japanese defenders entrenched in swamps and jungle. Type 92 guns were positioned to cover narrow approaches, making frontal attacks costly. But once again, sustained machine gun fire changed the equation. American and Australian gunners coordinated their fire to pin defenders, while small units manoeuvred around fixed positions. No. The Type 92 could still kill, but it could no longer control the fight. As 1943 progressed, American doctrine matured. Machine guns were integrated more tightly with mortars, artillery, and air support. The M1919 was not expected to win battles alone. It was expected to hold the enemy still while other weapons finished the job. Japanese defences, meanwhile, grew more elaborate and more static. On islands like Tarawa and later Saipan, machine guns were embedded in bunkers, caves, and reinforced positions. The Type 92's stability and accuracy were valuable here, but its inability to sustain uninterrupted fire under constant pressure remained a problem. During amphibious assaults, American forces landed under intense fire. Casualties were heavy. But once beachheads were established, M1919s were brought ashore rapidly. As soon as they were operational, the character of the fight shifted. Japanese gunners found themselves facing continuous suppression from multiple directions, limiting their ability to engage targets effectively. This was the moment when the imbalance became undeniable. American commanders observed that once machine gun dominance was established, Japanese resistance, no matter how determined, became localized and containable. Positions could be reduced systematically. Attacks lost coordination. Defensive fire became reactive rather than controlling. The Type 92 had not failed in design. It had been overtaken by a system designed for a different kind of war. By mid-1943, the outcome of machine gun engagements across the Pacific followed a predictable pattern. Initial contact, Japanese fire, American suppression, maneuver, collapse. What began as adaptation had become doctrine, and as the war pushed toward the Central Pacific, the consequences of this shift would be felt on an even larger scale, where sustained fire would no longer decide individual engagements, but entire campaigns. By 1944, the contest between the M1919 and the Type 92 had moved beyond jungle skirmishes and into battles of scale, where entire islands became testing grounds for sustained firepower. On Saipan, American forces faced a deeply entrenched Japanese defense. Machine guns were positioned in mutually supporting networks, covering beaches, ridgelines, and interior approaches. Type 92 crews fought with discipline and determination, often remaining at their guns until killed. But the environment had changed. American landings were now backed by overwhelming naval gunfire, air support, and coordinated infantry advances. Once ashore, M1919s were deployed in depth. Instead of single guns suppressing single positions, American units used overlapping fields of sustained fire. Japanese gunners attempting to engage one sector found themselves suppressed from another. The pauses inherent in strip-fed operation became increasingly dangerous as American guns simply did not go silent. On Peleliu, the pattern repeated under even harsher conditions. Japanese defenders had adapted, abandoning exposed positions in favor of caves and reverse slope defenses. Type 92s were concealed, protected, and lethal when they fired, but once revealed, they faced the same problem: sustained American suppression that limited their ability to dominate terrain. The terrain. American after-action reports from Peleliu frequently note the role of machine guns in maintaining pressure during assaults on cave complexes. M1919 crews fired for extended periods, pinning defenders while flamethrowers, demolitions, and infantry teams advanced. The machine gun had become the backbone of tempo control. The final and most decisive demonstration came at Okinawa. Here, Japanese defences were layered, deliberate, and resilient. Type 92s were integrated into a comprehensive defensive system designed to inflict maximum casualties, and they did. American losses were severe, but the fundamental dynamic remained unchanged. Where American machine guns could establish sustained fire, Japanese positions were neutralized over time. The critical factor was not rate of fire alone, but continuity. The M1919 could fire, pause briefly, and resume, again and again, without surrendering control. Japanese guns, constrained by feed strips and crew fatigue, could not match that rhythm under constant pressure. By this stage of the war, Japanese commanders understood the disparity. But adaptation was limited by resources, industry, and time. There was no equivalent replacement for the Type 92. There was no way to match American logistical depth. The realization was stark. The battlefield had become an environment where endurance alone was insufficient. Sustained dominance required systems, interlocking weapons, trained crews, and uninterrupted supply. In the closing months of the Pacific War, machine gun engagements rarely determined outcomes on their own. But they shaped every advance. They decided when infantry could move. They dictated when assaults stalled or succeeded. The Type 92 remained deadly until the end. Its crews fought with discipline and courage, but they fought inside a framework that no longer fit the war being fought. The M1919, by contrast, was not a perfect weapon. It overheated, it jammed, it demanded effort, but it belonged to a system that could absorb those flaws and keep firing. By 1945, the verdict was no longer in doubt. The war had proven that in the age of industrial conflict, control of the battlefield belonged to the side that could sustain fire the longest, without pause, without hesitation. And when the guns finally fell silent, the consequences of that lesson would extend far beyond the Pacific. When the fighting ended on each island, the evidence lay scattered across the ground. Spent belts, empty feed strips, shattered tripods, and machine guns still pointed toward fields of fire their crews would never cross again. American units moving through captured Japanese positions encountered the same scene repeatedly. Type 92 machine guns were found intact, often with ammunition still nearby. Many had not been destroyed by mechanical failure or direct hits. Their crews had been killed, suppressed, or forced into silence by sustained fear that made continued operation impossible. US after-action reports did not describe the Type 92 as ineffective. On the contrary, it was consistently acknowledged as accurate, rugged, and dangerous when properly emplaced. What commanders emphasized instead was neutralization. Japanese machine guns were not always destroyed. They were rendered unable to influence the battle long enough for American forces to maneuver. Casualty figures reflected this dynamic. Initial assaults against Japanese defenses often produced heavy American losses, particularly when machine gun positions were concealed and overlapping. But once 1919s were brought forward and suppression established, casualty rates dropped sharply. The difference was not courage or skill. It was time under fire. Japanese forces attempted to adapt. Machine guns were repositioned deeper into cave systems. Fire was withheld until targets were at close range. Ammunition was conserved even more strictly. These measures increased lethality in brief moments, but they did not change the underlying balance. Each engagement became shorter, more violent, and more isolated. Logistics worsened the problem. As the war progressed, Japanese supply lines deteriorated under American naval and air dominance. Ammunition shortages became chronic. Machine gun crews were forced to ration fire even more severely. In contrast, American units continued to receive belts of ammunition in quantities that supported prolonged engagements. This disparity shaped battlefield psychology. American infantry learned to trust their machine guns implicitly. When pinned, they waited for suppression. When advancing, they coordinated movement around sustained fire. The presence of an M1919 signaled stability, even in chaos. Japanese infantry, increasingly isolated and undersupplied, came to view American machine guns as fixed barriers rather than threats to be overcome. Assaults were delayed. Movement became more cautious. Initiative faded. By late 1944, machine gun dominance had become an assumed feature of American operations. Tactical planning accounted for it automatically. Japanese planning, constrained by reality, could only work around it. The result was not immediate collapse, but inevitability. Each battle followed a familiar arc: resistance, suppression, containment, reduction. Machine guns no longer decided battles in isolation, but they dictated the terms on which every engagement unfolded. And as the war drew closer to Japan itself, the implications of that imbalance extended beyond tactics into the strategic future warfare. When the Pacific War ended, the assessment of weapons was no longer theoretical. It was grounded in years of reports, battlefield studies, and hard-earned conclusions. American analysts reviewing captured Japanese equipment noted that the Type 92 had performed exactly as it was designed to perform. It was reliable in harsh environments. It maintained accuracy over long periods. It rarely failed mechanically. In isolation, it was a capable weapon. But war does not reward isolation. The post-war evaluation made clear that the Type 92's limitations were not flaws of engineering, but consequences of doctrine. Its feed system weight and intended role reflected a belief in deliberate positional warfare. Against an opponent capable of sustained suppressive fire, those assumptions collapsed. The M1919, meanwhile, emerged as a model of adaptability. It was not flawless. Crews reported barrel overheating, the need for careful maintenance, and the physical toll of operating the gun for extended periods. But these challenges were mitigated by training, logistics and doctrine that assumed continuous use. The machine gun had become a system weapon. This realization influenced post-war military thinking worldwide. Sustained fire, crew coordination and logistical integration became central to infantry doctrine. Machine guns were no longer seen as static anchors, but as mobile sources of battlefield control. For Japan, the lesson was painful and final. The Imperial Army had fought with discipline and resolve, but its weapons reflected a world that no longer existed by 1945. Industrial warfare had overtaken endurance-based doctrine. Firepower was no longer something to be rationed. It was something to be rationed. It was something to be sustained. Survivor accounts echoed this conclusion. Japanese veterans recalled the difficulty of operating under constant suppression, the sense of being pinned without reprieve. American veterans remembered the relief of hearing their machine guns open up, the feeling that the battlefield had been steadied, even briefly. The machine gun duel between the M1919 and the Type 92 did not decide the Pacific War alone. But it revealed the underlying truth of that war. Victory belonged to the side that could impose rhythm, maintain pressure, and deny the enemy time to recover. When the guns finally cooled, they left behind more than spent metal. They left behind a blueprint for modern infantry warfare, one written not in theory, but in sustained fire. That legacy, however, cannot be understood without stepping back from numbers and mechanisms, and asking what this imbalance meant for the people who lived through it. Who'd through it? In the quiet that followed the Pacific battles, the guns lay silent. The M1919, the Type 92, both machines of war, had spoken in ways that no report or map could fully capture. One had dominated by rhythm, endurance, and integration into a system, the other by precision, discipline, and steadfastness. Both were products of their nations, their doctrines, and their histories. The human cost was immense. Gun crews, infantry, and support units had measured their lives in bursts of fire and seconds of exposure. For the Japanese, each pause to reload a Type 92 was fraught with danger. Each sustained volley from the Americans a reminder of the relentless weight of industrial warfare. For the Americans, the M1919 became more than a weapon. It was a tool of control, of reassurance, a heartbeat of coordinated action that allowed men to move, advance, and survive. Beyond the battlefield, the encounter of these two machine guns revealed a broader truth about warfare in the modern age. Technology alone does not guarantee victory, nor does courage. Victory belongs to those who can integrate weapons, people, and logistics into a continuous, unbroken rhythm of action. Firepower is as much psychological as it is mechanical. A gun that fires relentlessly changes the way men fight, think, and endure. In the islands of the Pacific, the Type 92 was not defeated by bullets alone. It was defeated by the system surrounding the M1919, a system of training, doctrine, supply and coordination that amplified every shot. The lessons of these engagements would shape post-war infantry warfare, emphasizing sustained fire, crew synergy and industrial support as the pillars of modern combat. In the end, the clash of these two guns tells a story not just of hardware, but of human adaptation, of the limits of endurance, and of how technology, when married to strategy, can tilt the scales of battle. The M1919 did not merely outgun the Type 92, it outpaced it, outlasted it, and in doing so, defined a new era of warfare where rhythm and continuity were the most lethal weapons of all.